Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Meaning in Marble, Civil War Monuments and American Identity, an online professional development seminar from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. Now, before we get underway, I'd like to take a minute just to introduce the National Humanities Center to you. Some of you have already heard this introduction, so please bear with me as I tell people that the Center is located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, tucked in among the cities of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. It's the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. That's a real mouthful, so let me see if I can unpack that for you. We're an independent institution. That means we're a private nonprofit. We're an institute for advanced study, and that means that the main program we offer here is a fellowship program that brings scholars to the center, usually for an academic year, to research and write books and articles on the humanities. Topics in history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We've had about 1,100 scholars work at the center since we opened in 1978, and they've produced about 1,200 books. Now, that may make the place sound like an ivory tower, and when you look at these pictures, you can believe that it is an ivory tower. We even have a spiral staircase going right up through the middle of the building, but the place isn't an ivory tower. Founders wanted it to connect with a wide array of audiences, and they were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that in three ways right now. Our online seminars, which you folks have discovered, and we're glad you have. Please join us for some other seminars. We have a complete schedule that takes us through the spring. If you want to sign up for any additional ones, you better do so because they are filling up rapidly. We also offer a service called TeacherServe. This is a website consisting of three of what we call instructional guides. One deals with religion and American history, another with the environment in American history, and the other with teaching African American literature and history. If you go to these websites, you'll find essays written by leading scholars on topics that are germane in these three areas for the high school classroom. And the essays offer advice on how to teach these topics, as well as advice on illumination on the various topics you'll find there. We also offer our toolbox library. These are collections of primary sources, historical documents, literary text, images, audio material. They're organized thematically within chronological frames, and they're illuminated by extensive notes and questions, and they really make great classroom teaching resources. Now, if you want to keep abreast of what's going on in the education programs at the Humanities Center, if you want to find out about new seminars and new online resources, please become a fan of the Humanities Center on our new Facebook page. We'd love to have you join us. Now, let me say that when this program is over, you will be able to obtain a recording of the seminar and have access to the PowerPoint through the very same website that you accessed the readings for the seminar. The PowerPoint is there for you to use, so if you want to take any of the images or text back from the seminar into your classes, please feel free to do so. At this website, you will also find our online evaluation. It's very important to us that you fill that out. So at the end of the seminar, please click on that evaluation, take 15 minutes or so to fill it out, and shoot it back to us. We pay attention to what you say, and we use your advice to try to improve our seminars. Now, you will receive from us a documentation of participation. This is a letter we'll send you via email that certifies that you participated in the seminar, and you can present this to certifying authorities in your locale to receive whatever recertification credit your participation in the seminar warrants. Now, here's how the seminar is going to proceed this evening. Professor Savage will be lecturing, and his lecture will be keyed to a presentation of slides with images and text excerpts that will illustrate important points. Some of the excerpts will analyze through discussion, others will not. But again, let me remind you that the presentation is there for you to use should you want to do so. Now, how do you participate? Well, let me point that out to you. If you want to raise your hand and make a comment or ask a question orally, click on the hand raised icon right there next to the arrow that I put on the screen. The icon will appear right here next to your name. I'll see it, and when I get the opportunity to do so, I'll pass the microphone to you, and you can hold forth. If you'd rather send a chat message, you can put your cursor down here in the little box at the bottom of the screen, type out your message, click send, and your message will appear in the chat box above. If you find the chat distracting, if it's rolling by and distracting you from your seminar, you can click on this little arrow here, which will collapse the chat panel. When you want to reopen it, just click on it again and it will pop open. Now, don't worry about missing any of the chat because what I'll be doing during the seminar is reading the chat and bringing it in at appropriate moments. So should you close the chat panel, you're not going to miss anything. Are there any questions now before we get underway? We're ready to go. If you're ready to go, send me one of those little smiley faces. There we go. Okay, we need a few more before we can go ahead. Wonderful. All right, I think we're ready to move. Okay, so let's do that now. We have two simple goals this evening. We want to explore how public monuments shaped the memory of the Civil War and how that memory changed over time. And we also want to suggest ways to read Civil War monuments so that you can use them in your teaching. Now, a number of you participated in the forum before the seminar. I looked at that, and from it, I called the main themes. And there are three: how public monuments shape the memory and meaning of the war, how Civil War monuments reflect values and issues, and then how to read or interpret monuments. So I think this seminar this evening is going to hit the concerns you raised in the forum squarely on the head. And to help us do that, we have with us this evening Kirk Savage, who is a professor of art history at the University of Pittsburgh, where he researches and teaches on art of the United States. Most recently, in 2009, he published Monuments, Wars, Washington, D.C. and the National Mall, and the Transformation of the Memorial Landscape. However, we're more interested in the book he published in 1998, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, Race, War, and Monument in 19th Century America. Now let me find Kirk's name here on the list and turn the program over to him. Okay, Kirk, it's all yours.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. And I've been reading your posts on my email, so I know that you come from all over the place and from different backgrounds, which should be, I think, really interesting. What I want to do tonight is, first of all, start and kind of tell you a little bit about how the presentation will go and what topics we will be covering. And I want to make sure and give you then plenty of time to interact with you so that you can ask questions or pose issues, and we can make this really into a dialogue for you. So the first, there are a couple of issues that I want to, or sets of issues that I want to make sure that we really delve into tonight. And so one set of issues has to do with why Civil War soldier monuments were erected in the first place. I've been teaching this material to college students for a long time, and they live in a world where soldier monuments, ordinary soldier monuments or common soldier monuments are commonplace. I mean, where they're pretty much everywhere. And so they take them for granted. And they don't have any idea that this kind of form of monument really took off only after the Civil War. That before the Civil War, there were actually relatively few war memorials, and they were rather different in character. And the common soldier monument, as we know it, really didn't exist at that time. It didn't really come into full flower until the last third of the 19th century and then into the 20th century. And so that raises a set of questions about why. Why did the common soldier monument become kind of the dominant form of memorialization of the Civil War? Why weren't other kinds of solutions, other kinds of memorial solutions embraced instead, like the figure that we see on the screen right now, the freedmen that we'll be talking about in just a little bit? Why was the figure of the common soldier then the one which became a kind of our kind of natural idea of what a war memorial is supposed to look like? So there's a whole set of issues about that development. Now there's another set of issues then about which groups, who actually was able to erect these monuments and why. Which groups in society had the authority and the power to erect these memorials, and for what reasons did they do so? Now again, with my students, they don't tend to ask these questions unless they're prompted to. So they sort of tend to think of monuments almost as if they're kind of natural things like, plants that grow out of the landscape, that just appear because they simply appear because they reflect whatever society was thinking at any given moment. Well, in fact, monuments are always erected by particular groups of people for particular reasons and for their own agendas. And so the whole process of monument building is inherently a political process, and one that is really not neutral. And so if I can get those kinds of two sets of issues across to you today, when we begin to think about how to get students to think about these issues and what they can learn from them, then I think we will have gone a long way here today. And we'll have a chance at towards the end of our 90 minutes here to talk about some of the monuments that some of you have added that we've added to the PowerPoint presentation from some of your own localities, and we can think about them in relation to the larger national picture. And at the very end, I also have some suggestions for reading, because I know some of you are interested in going deeper into the subject than we can in the 90 minutes that we have tonight. Richard suggested that we talk a bit about the kinds of questions that you could ask, that you could have your students pose, or that you could pose to your students about particular works of memorial sculpture or public monuments that have been erected actually in the landscape. So I set up a couple of slides for you here, and I won't go through every question right now, because we'll come back to some of these questions later when we see the whole PowerPoint. But this gives you an idea of the kinds of questions that I pose to students to get them to try to understand what realist sculpture like this, what the narrative is, what its intended meaning is, what viewers at the time might have understood by it, and so on. The questions that are then addressed to public monuments that are actually built are really even more complicated, because there's so many more factors involved here. There are assemblages of so many elements, not just sculpture, but inscriptions and architecture and so on. And so we have to deal with issues about location and why it was built in a certain place, and how much it cost, and who had the authority to erect it, and how big it was, and why, and so on and so forth. So we'll come back to those issues later. But I want to begin the historical narrative by actually talking for just a minute or two about what the landscape of war memorials was like before the Civil War. And so, again, I said that there were, relatively speaking, very few war memorials before the Civil War. There weren't many, Revolutionary War monuments. There were a few scattered around battlefield areas. There were even fewer monuments to, for example, the Mexican-American War. Now we're looking at one here, a Mexican-American war memorial that deals with the Mexican-American war hero, a guy named William Jenkins Worth. And this is an example of one kind of monument that was erected before the Civil War, and then afterwards as well, into the early 20th century. It was basically monuments to great officers or individual heroes, commanders. This is a monument type that would, after the Civil War, would coexist with the common soldier monument. And this is a wonderful example of one in New York City that was erected in the 1850s, and actually the remains of this general were buried underneath the monument here in Manhattan, in Madison Square. The monument is still, obviously, is still there today. Hardly anybody looks at it or knows what it is. But the monument was erected because of his valiant, service in the Mexican-American War. Now, the Mexican-American War was, of course, an extremely important historical, event in the nation's history, because it's what actually led to then the expansion of the nation across the continent to the West Coast and the Pacific Ocean. So it's a major war, which eventually actually led to the Civil War because of all the acquisition of that new territory. And yet it's not marked in the landscape in public monuments, except in a few of these kind of officer monuments that are scattered around the country and that nobody really pays attention to anymore. So that's an example of one. There's a little detail here. Again, he's the great man on horseback, shown in relief here. His participation in the Battle of Mexico, City of Mexico, the Battle of Mexico City is inscribed there, so we know what historical event we're talking about, but nobody pays attention to it nowadays. Now, there were a few monuments erected before the Civil War too that marked the deaths of ordinary soldiers in places like Lexington, Concord, Massachusetts, and in the North and the South. And they tended to sort of look like cemetery monuments, like this one here. Again, this is an obelisk, and on a square base. And what it's erected actually it was erected in Pennsylvania, this town called Wyoming, Pennsylvania, where there was a battle. And again, the remains of the men who died there are actually buried in the vault underneath the monument, and their names are inscribed there. The names, and they're separated out by rank. Officers are separated from common soldiers. And so there were a few monuments like this that were known before the Civil War period, but they were relatively few, and there certainly were no images of common soldiers like what we would see in the standard monument after the Civil War. So I think it's important when we frame the whole issue of why monuments were even erected, why war memorials were erected after the Civil War to begin with, it's important to get students to think about this as a really transitional moment here, when there were possibilities for many different kinds of monuments that might be erected, and people, in fact, were talking about it. There was critical discussion about what kind of monument should be erected after the war had ended. And I'm showing you, an extract from William Dean Howells, who wrote a very interesting essay on this question. A few others did as well, where he was arguing, in fact, that there should be the Civil War monument shouldn't actually show soldiers and shouldn't be allegorical. Allegories were and typically female figures that stand for things like liberty or union or whatever. He was arguing that this was a new kind of war, and it demanded a new kind of monument. And the one example that he could point to was get us back to this image of the freedmen by what was then a young sculptor named John Quincy Adams Ward, who was actually a friend of Howells's. And Howells then remarks this was the kind of thing, a sublime parable, the kind of full expression of one idea that should be commemorated. So I often, if I'm introducing this subject to students, I often use this image first, because I ask them, so why wasn't this particular sculpture used or ever erected as a war memorial? Because it wasn't, even though William Dean Howells and actually several other important literary and cultural critics actually suggested that this would make a wonderful war memorial. It was never actually built at full scale. It was always only in the form of a little 20-inch statuette. It was basically marketed in a very small number of copies and sold to people for display in their own homes, like on their parlor table. But it was never mass-produced. It was never erected as a public monument. So I asked my students that question, how was it that somebody like William Dean Howells in 1865 could actually imagine that American communities might erect this figure as their war memorial? And I'd like to actually sort of pose that maybe to you in the audience, and we could get some thoughts about that, about why this was in effect a non-starter. Why did it simply disappear?
Okay, let's ask them. Why did this memorial not get built in anything larger than a 20-inch tall bronze for display at home? Why was it not a public monument? Any response? Okay. can chat your response in, or you can raise your hand. Okay. Because it was a black man. Well, it's close. All right. The subject, the freedman, was not seen as an appropriate war memorial. Mixed feelings about the issue of slavery. Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Well, Kirk, here we go. When you think of war memorials, you usually think of those that served in the Army. Good point. Why isn't it called the freedmen or the military? And the consensus seems to be, Kirk, that this was just an inappropriate figure for a public memorial on all sorts of for all sorts of reasons, racial, and it doesn't capture it doesn't reflect the military.
Right. Well, and so these are all, good responses, and very much like the kinds of responses that I tend to get from my students, because they think, well, a war memorial is supposed to celebrate and commemorate the soldiers who fought in the war. What it's not supposed to do is actually commemorate the cause or the idea or the outcome for which the war was fought. Howells was arguing very differently, of course, at that time. He was saying, we're not a military people. We don't need to commemorate our soldiers. They're not interested in it anymore, in war anymore. They're going back to peacetime pursuits, peaceful pursuits. So the only reason in Howells' mind for actually even memorializing the Civil War in the first place was to actually commemorate the great accomplishment of the war, which was the abolition of slavery. And so he thought this would be, for him, this was a more honorific kind of monument than simply an ordinary soldier on a pedestal or an officer on a pedestal. Now, the responses that I got from you about, but aren't war memorials supposed to commemorate soldiers, and those are precisely the kinds of assumptions about war memorials that we now have based on 150 years of almost 150 years of very intensive memorial building to common soldiers. The racial character of the memorials also is equally interesting, and here's where we really get into the kind of political controversy surrounding a figure like this, where we have white communities throughout the, say, Northeast, and of course, the Confederates were obviously not going to erect this kind of monument at all. But even in the, say, strongly abolitionist-leaning communities in New England, showed no interest in erecting this kind of memorial either. And if we think about the demographics of those communities, if they were all white communities, or largely white communities, essentially they want to commemorate themselves, and they're not interested in commemorating an abstract idea that of the abolition of slavery, particularly if that abstract idea is put into the form of an actual black man. And again, the point was raised here. Before, this was actually the first figure that we know of, first figure of an African American ever cast in bronze, in any format, in any size. And so, African American figures just didn't even exist in sculpture at that time. So it would have been quite a powerful statement to put something like that up on a pedestal.
Kirk, let me ask you, how popular was this as a 20-inch tall statuette?
Well, it was essentially a luxury item. So, we know there were we don't know how many casts were made, but they were a very small number, probably between 10 and 20. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. So it wasn't anything remotely
it was not
like mass marketing.
It wasn't mass produced like the John Rogers, plaster, sort of cheap plaster sculptures that sometimes went into the hundreds of copies. these were much more rare.
Oh, okay.
Now, I posed some questions about this that, we don't have really probably time to go over them right now, but I posed a number of questions about this particular sculpture and the narrative that it tells. And one of the examples that I gave there was to have your students actually take the pose of the statue, to get up out of their chair, sit and resituate themselves in the chair, kind of in the way that he is sitting on this tree stump with the arms in exactly the same kind of position. It's a really, really interesting exercise to do because it's also kind of a fun thing to do in the middle of class to change the dynamic of the class. But it's also pedagogically really interesting because it gets you to kind of feel the narrative. So you learn things about the body that's being depicted in the sculpture by doing that. And you learn, for example, that he's not sitting at rest here, that he's actually kind of poised on the edge of that tree stump, that he's pushing his hand down as if he's about to get up, or either sitting himself down or about to get up. So he's not in a fixed position. And by taking that, getting that insight into the figure, you can really understand that this is a narrative about a slave that's in the midst of flight, who's in the midst of flight, who is in fact a fugitive. And he's in between the state of slavery and the state of freedom. Now, I argued in my book, this is yet another reason, this might be what we consider a third reason why this monument was never, why this figure was never erected as a public monument, because he's actually kind of a liminal figure. He's in between states, and his final future hasn't been decided yet. And public monuments tend to be much more decisive. They tend to be to try to make clear statements about the meaning of a historical event. And this monument doesn't do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Kirk, we have a question or a comment from Kathleen. Let me pass the microphone. Kathleen, it's all yours.
I'm trying to get on. Sorry.
Oh, you're on. You have no question or comment?
No, I was trying to send a comment.
Okay.
Basically, it was to me, it was the idea that the slaves were almost a secondary issue, and that the focus seemed to be on reunification and the glories of saving the Union at the end of the war, and so the freedmen were more or less forgotten.
Good point. Thank you, Kirk. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, that is essentially what happened over the course of the 19th century, is that increasingly, as more and more time elapsed, the story of the fugitive slaves, as well as the African Americans who actually served in the Union Army, those stories began to fade very much in white collective memory. And the war increasingly came to be seen as a war that was about reunion rather than about abolition. Now, what's different here is that in the mid-1860s, this particular sculpture was made in 1863, shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, and so it was very much a response to the Emancipation Proclamation, a very much of the moment kind of sculpture, work of art. And that interest in the black body and in the meaning of freedom after abolition, that interest remained high for several years, into the late 1860s. And a number of sculptors really grappled with that issue and tried, in a sense, to kind of imagine the black body differently, imagine African Americans post-slavery, because their visual representation had always been tied to slavery before the war. And so that became a very interesting sculptural problem, because sculpture, as it was conceived then, is just about the human body. So how do you represent the notion of freedom through the human body? And sculptors were very interested in that, and the culture at large was very interested in the consequences of the abolition of slavery, and that's what the Reconstruction period was about. But you're absolutely right that interest is going to drain away relatively rapidly even by the 1870s. We're beginning to see retreat from Reconstruction in federal policy and in Northern popular opinion, and an increasing attention to the war as basically a struggle between two, a fratricidal struggle of white man against white man, and the African Americans kind of disappear from that equation.
I'd like to, Kirk, if I might, I'd just like to draw everybody's attention to the comment Brent Tomerlin made in the chat about how the freedmen would be a good work of art to link with the Emancipation Proclamation in teaching. Thank you for that comment. And if any of you, if any other participants want to share teaching ideas, please do. That's one of the reasons we have these seminars. So feel free to share your ideas. Kirk?
Yeah, I think yeah, it is, and I absolutely do that in my courses. I very much pair it with the Emancipation Proclamation. We talk about what's happening at that moment and the whole phenomenon of the fugitive slaves, and how fugitive slaves themselves took their own destiny into their own hands, and in a sense led Lincoln to create the Emancipation Proclamation in the first place. And it's interesting then that the Emancipation Proclamation is not very much remembered or commemorated in public monuments. It's not quoted even in Union monuments. It's quoted much less than is, for example, the Gettysburg Address, which appears in a lot of Union war memorials. But the Emancipation Proclamation is much rarer, and of course there really aren't any independent monuments to it that are erected after the war. So if we go to the next slide, which is the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Boston Common from 1877. So this is an early example of a common soldier monument, and a very elaborate one. It was erected, obviously, very elaborate because it was erected by the city of Boston, and Boston took obviously great pride in its contribution to the Union war effort, and so put a lot of money into it. And it's a kind of hybrid memorial that is both allegorical and realistic. So it's got allegorical figures, meaning these female figures who stand for ideas like victory and so on it, as well as you can see at the base on the right, there's a figure of a sailor. There's also a figure of a soldier. So we begin to see now, this is the point in time which we begin to see for the first time. It's in the mid-1860s that it actually starts, but we begin to see images, sculptural images of common soldiers. So these are not great officers. These are not famous men. These are not people who have distinguished themselves on the battlefield in any way. They are actually anonymous, kind of everyman figures who are meant to stand in and represent the collective, the soldiers, the local soldiers from that area who volunteered to fight in the Army or the Navy.
Kirk, what's the figure at the top? Is it Columbia or?
No, I believe that is a figure of victory.
Oh.
Now, I think there's a figure of history. The other thing about allegorical figures is that they tend to be kind of interchangeable. One figure could stand for a lot of different things, and it depends on the props that they're holding. This particular figure looks like it's holding a flag, but I do believe it's a figure of victory. Yeah.
So it's the common soldier, but it's the common soldier placed in a context that really ennobles the common soldier.
Yes, absolutely. So that's what the allegorical sculpture was supposed to do, is supposed to put the common soldier into this much more ennobling and uplifting narrative. Now, a lot of communities began to then erect monuments like this, except they didn't have the same funds that a city like Boston had, so the monuments become much simpler and sparer and tend to have, say, just one figure on them, a figure of a standing soldier, for example, at parade rest. Now, I put up here on this slide an extract from Wendell Phillips, here, who was the famous abolitionist before, the antebellum abolitionist, and from Boston, writing about, in 1879, or actually speaking, and this is the text of a lecture that he was giving on monuments in Boston, and he talks about the Union Monument here on the Boston Common, and makes this very interesting comment that it's fine as far as it goes, but it's like almost every other Civil War memorial that's being erected at the time. It doesn't say anything about why the Civil War was fought in the first place. And so he said, you know, the war might have been like that of 1812 for free trade and sailors' rights, or for a northeastern boundary. You search in vain through them all for the broken chain or the Negro soldier. And Phillips is one of the rare people at this time actually complaining about this at the time, complaining about the fact that these monuments simply are, in a sense, meaningless because they aren't, they could be monuments to any war. They don't have anything specifically to do with the great moral cause of the Civil War and of the Union cause. And so he concludes by saying that they, you know, his thought is that if monuments should be erected at all, they should tell the truth. And if they were to tell the truth, they would have to tell the story of slavery and abolition. And I'm just showing you the one place that this particular memorial actually refers to in any way to that story is in this lone figure of an African American on one of the reliefs, J.B. Smith, who was actually a well-known, prosperous African American in the Boston community, who was heavily involved in recruiting black soldiers, for example, at that time. And we see the vandalism on this monument is really, again, something that you see on quite a few public monuments, but it's actually fairly shocking to see this here in Boston. So as I said, the Common Soldier Monument really begins to take off. It first appears in 1865, actually shortly after the war was over. And in the Northeast, there are a number of these Common Soldier Monuments that are erected in the 1870s. But it really takes off towards the end of the 19th century as a kind of national phenomenon that goes across all regions of the country, not just the Northeast, not just New England, but into the Mid-Atlantic, into the Confederate States, where starting in particularly the last quarter of the 19th century, white Southern communities begin to erect monuments to Confederate soldiers, and they follow the same pattern as the monuments that are erected to the Union soldiers. So we see Mills County, Texas. I'm just going to show you a few examples. They tend to be soldiers at parade, it's called parade rest, with their rifle not engaged. They're not shown in a combat position, but shown in a rest position. Mount Vernon, New York, where I believe Denzel Washington is from. So I was imagining Denzel Washington looking at this monument at some point when he was a boy. Again, the typical white soldier figure on the pedestal with a kind of generic inscription would not tend to say anything about slavery or the moral cause of the war, as Howells explained it, but would simply be a recognition of the ordinary soldier. And even as far afield, an example that I find rather fascinating, and I think there are a couple of people from California in the session. Here's an example of a standing soldier monument from Pasadena, California. I think it was erected in the early 19-teens, just before the U.S. got into World War I. And Pasadena, what's so interesting to me about this example is that Pasadena, California, unlike the previous examples where they're actually commemorating soldiers from their own community who signed up and volunteered for the war from that community. Because as you probably know, the way in which soldiers were recruited in the Civil War is they were recruited locally. There wasn't the kind of national centralized recruiting apparatus or selective service that we have now. So most of the soldiers actually volunteered, and they mostly volunteered as part of local regiments organized by local communities. And it was these regiments that were then tend to be commemorated by the monuments after the Civil War. But here we are out in Pasadena. Pasadena did not exist as a town in the 1860s during the Civil War. So there was no town of Pasadena. And so my question then is, and I'll again throw that out because this might be an example of something that you could actually pose to your students. Given that Pasadena did not exist during the Civil War, so therefore sent no soldiers to the Civil War on either the Union or the Confederate side, why would the town erect a monument, a Civil War monument, 50 years after the war was over?
Why do you think Pasadena would erect this monument? Good Americans, Mary Ogden says. A way to emphasize union.
So, yeah, I think what you're getting at, good Americans, is absolutely right in the sense of one thing. Here's another purpose of these of these war memorials, and one reason, in fact, why they tend to look so similar from community to community is that they are not only commemorating themselves in a sense, but they're also showing that they belong to this larger collective called the nation. And so they establish their own loyalty, their own sense of patriotism and connection to the larger nation by erecting a local monument on the town green to the Civil War soldier.
We have one question here asked, excuse me, Kirk, we have one questioner who asked, where is the monument? And then another one makes a very good point. There were many ex-soldiers from the South and North that settled in California. The Owens Valley north of LA is just one of them. Did Pasadena receive, do you know if Pasadena received an influx of, at this time, of ex-Civil War veterans?
Yeah, I did read that there were actually quite a number of Civil War veterans in Pasadena, and they tended to be Union veterans, because this is a Union monument. This is not a Confederate monument. Mm-hmm. It's a Union monument. And so what drove the erection of the monument, in fact, was the veteran community in Pasadena. As far as where it is exactly, I'm sorry, I actually don't know, because it's been a long time since I've been to Pasadena, and when I was last there, I wasn't looking for the Civil War Memorial. Uh-huh. But I'm assuming that it's a town green. Or town square or park in the center of town. They tend to be in areas like that, or times in important intersections, traffic intersections in the middle of town.
Well, Kara Gleason raises the issue of how a monument would reflect the contemporary issues. If it was erected during or at the start of World War I, perhaps to send a message of the importance of citizens' engagement in wartime.
Yes, absolutely. And there you can see upsurges of monument building, for example, after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The first decade of the 20th century, the very end of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century was an extremely important time for Civil War monument construction. And that's interesting because, of course, the monument, by this time, you're talking about the historical event. The war had ended 35, 40 years earlier. And people ask, well, why were they still erecting monuments 35, 40 years later? And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that the veterans themselves were aging and dying and were increasingly propelling the drive to erect monuments throughout the North and the South, so that they could see it before they died. But it also was tied, as we say, to these other wars, like the Spanish-American War or World War I, where the upsurge in patriotism and basically the interest in military service goes up, and that's then the veterans tie their own efforts to these new wars and new military engagements, and are able to then raise money and so on, get support for monuments.
And Brett Tomberlin suggests here that this monument was erected around the 50th anniversary. Do key anniversaries like that prompt the building of monuments?
Well, they definitely were used as rationales. It's a little hard to tell, because if you actually chart this out, and as some people have, or are trying to chart the number of decade by decade when these monuments were erected, you'll see that they follow a certain, they kind of go on an upward slope from the end of the war up to about, the first few years of the 20th century, and then begin to decline. And they don't really cluster so much around particular dates like that, though those dates were extremely important in battlefield commemoration. And those, because they became then, the anniversaries became moments at which huge assemblies of veterans would gather at Gettysburg, or particularly, or other battlefields.
Your comment about monuments being built as the veterans die off parallels what's happened here with the World War II memorial that just recently opened on the Mall in Washington.
Sure, yes, and it's very much the same kind of thing. And we have to remember that here this gets us back to the question of who's erecting monuments and why. And if the veterans became a far more powerful lobby, political lobby and social force in American society after the Civil War than they had been before. And before the Civil War, veterans were honored, but they didn't have nearly the same presence in society. There were far fewer of them, for one thing. But also, there was, still in the early Republic, there was still a lot of anxiety and even outright hostility to the idea of a standing army. And it goes back to revolutionary ideology. And so it's really not until after the Civil War, into the late 19th century, that most Americans come to kind of accept the idea, really, of a standing army, and where the veteran takes a really honored place in the culture. And of course, there are a lot more of them because than there were in previous wars, because the Civil War was such a massive conflict that mobilized so many more soldiers than had ever been mobilized, in all the previous wars combined. And there were far more fatalities and far more soldiers who had terrible, disabilities and wounds from their service, who could still be seen, they could be seen on their wooden legs ever in across the country. And so the veteran just had a physical presence as well as a political and social presence in society that was one of the major reasons that drove the construction of these monuments. And why they then became, why war memorials became, in a sense, soldier monuments instead of other kinds of monuments, and why officer monuments began to wane in importance also compared to the common soldier monuments. So I wanted to raise the issue of the battlefield monument for, just because it's, again, another important development after the Civil War, where battlefields become much more, become preserved and become much more important than they had been before the Civil War, where they tended to be, private property and more the province of antiquarians who were interested in history rather than tourist sites that they became after the Civil War. And the Gettysburg battlefield is going to be is the most important of all the battlefield sites because of its because it was the battle that turned the tide of the Civil War. And so it was the first, Gettysburg is really the first place where there's a national soldier cemetery that is created. That's again another innovation of the Civil War and of Civil War memory. That before the Civil War, we don't have national soldier cemeteries. After the Civil War, we began to see development of these national cemeteries, like this one here, where actually different states actually collaborated to create this particular burying ground and then the monument in the center, which, like the Boston Monument, is a combination of allegorical and realist figures of soldiers and allegories, kind of explaining their importance in the national narrative. And yes, the battlefield of Gettysburg then became, over the course of the 19th century, became strewn with regimental and state memorials. Every regiment that participated in the battle, every Union regiment initially that participated in the battle, was permitted to erect a monument in a representative location, a location where they had fought on the battlefield. And so the battlefield of Gettysburg, instead of being actually restored to its appearance at the time of the battle, that wasn't the idea at all. The idea here was to make it essentially a huge canvas for public monuments of all kinds. And at the same time that that's happening, there's criticism of this beginning to emerge, that we're overbuilding monuments in places like Gettysburg and destroying the natural beauty of the site and not coordinating them, so it looks just like a kind of hodgepodge in a cemetery. These kinds of criticisms are going to be leveled at Civil War memorials of all kinds, on the battlefield as well as in cities and towns throughout the country, is that the more of them that are built, as they begin to start, as hundreds and hundreds of these begin to appear, you're going to see there was a backlash against them, not so much by the communities themselves, the local communities themselves that sponsored them, not that at all, but in fact by kind of more elites, national elites particularly, and particularly the art establishment, which came to be actually quite horrified by the whole phenomenon of the soldier monument, and tried to curtail the production of these monuments to the point where once World War I occurred, after World War I, there was a concerted campaign by architects, artists, and urban planners to try to stop soldier monuments from being erected. They ultimately failed. And this leads to then, so in some communities, in some cities particularly, we find incredibly elaborate Civil War memorials being erected that go far beyond the common soldier type. I'm using an example from my hometown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is allegedly the largest Civil War memorial ever erected. I'm not sure about that, but it's certainly it's a gigantic building that was erected as a soldiers and sailors memorial, and essentially this is a monument that fulfilled many different purposes. It wasn't just a sculptural figure honoring soldiers, even though there are actually some figures of soldiers and sailors outside the building that represent the armed forces. But it was actually a place where the veterans themselves, the various Grand Army posts this is the major veterans organization, the Union Veterans Organization in the country, the Grand Army of the Republic, their posts actually, they kind of got together and they decided to have the county build this enormous war memorial so that they could actually then the veterans themselves could meet inside the building and then deposit their artifacts inside the building. So the building has this wonderful auditorium in it, this huge auditorium with several thousand seats in it. again, with the Gettysburg Address here is inscribed inside on the auditorium wall, and it has a museum. It was originally a museum of just Civil War artifacts on the ground floor, on 4 corridors surrounding this auditorium. Everything from uniforms to shells in tree trunks and so on and so forth. So a really elaborate kind of multi-purpose monument, and there are a few of these around the country that still survive.
Well, now this one, Kirk, as you know, this one was submitted by Kathleen Daisy, who I guess lives in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and she responded to our invitation for people to send in local monuments. Kathleen, let me turn your microphone on. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about this monument?
It was really the figure is in honor of a man by the name of Howe, who was one of the officers going from Haverhill. The man he was killed in one of the battles, and the man whose body is represented was another soldier who had served 2 terms of duty, one in the Carolinas and one somewhere else in the South. It was done by a local architect, made by a local architect, and financed by the town council. So it really is really a parochial or a local effort overall.
And how is it used in the town? Is it just kind of a fixture, or on Veterans Day or Memorial Day? Is it the site of commemoration services?
It's the starting point for the parade on November 11th and on May 30th, which ends up at a local cemetery where many of the veterans of wars going back as far actually as some of the French and Indian War anyway are buried.
Mm-hmm. Kirk, what do you make of this one?
Well, it very much follows the format of a typical standing soldier memorial. So it looks very much like, literally thousands of other monuments that are erected around the country. And it's interesting, the financing of the monument is interesting because you raise an important question, which I haven't really addressed, which is who's paying for it and why, and who's paying for these monuments and why. And the answer to that question is extremely complex because it really varies a lot from case to case. So you said that it was the town council that actually supplied the money out of the public treasury for this monument. In many cases, that is true, that there is public money being used to erect local memorials. In a lot of cases, though, the memorials are erected by subscription campaigns. In other words, they went out and raised money from the local population. They expected people to donate the money for it, and for it to be kind of a free will offering from the community. And in practice, it was actually very difficult to get enough funds that way, and often, even in those cases, often they had to be subsidized by the local government. But many public monuments, many war memorials in the 19th and early 20th century United States were financed by this means, by means of voluntary donations, or at least partly by voluntary donations. And in many cases, we have women's groups that were very active in the fundraising campaigns. That's particularly true in the South, in the Confederate South, where Confederate memorials tended to be erected, organized, and the campaigns tended to be organized, and the monuments tended to be funded and erected by groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. But it's also, it's more true of the North and of the Union than people think. There were these ladies' auxiliary associations that were auxiliary associations of the veterans groups, the male veterans groups, and they were often instrumental in raising the money to erect these monuments.
And this one here, from the inscription, we see that it casts the purpose of the war as saving the Union. This is the
That's
inscription beneath it. Now, Kathleen, you sent in another slide of an addition to that monument. This slide, could you tell us about this? This is really curious. I couldn't figure out quite what this is.
No one seems to know, including the person who's supposedly the expert on the monument. Somehow it seems to have just appeared.
Well, I was very intrigued by the dove here, the white dove on the
Yes.
piece. So, which is, that's traditionally that's a symbol of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wondered if there was some kind of, pacifist intent behind it or something.
Could be.
Well, Kathleen, did this just appear one night? I mean,
Yeah, apparently it did. And since nobody knew where it came from, nobody dared to take it down.
Well, that's understandable. A question here about the motif above the crossed swords. Kirk, could you comment on that motif? Looks like a shield. Or maybe Kathleen could describe it if we can't see it clearly.
I'm having a hard time seeing it, but it looks sort of like a coat of arms to me. Is that sometimes there are coats of arms that are the representation of the local community or the state or whatever. They have a particular kind of coat of arm or a seal that they use, which is often inscribed or often carved on the pedestal of the monument. Could
Kathleen?
be something like that.
Yeah, Kathleen, could
yes.
you shed any light on that?
The writing is more or less has faded out into oblivion there. So I'm not sure what it is, other than it may very well be representative of the city and just the the almost a decorative kind of making war pretty with the crossed swords.
I see.
Right.
I see.
And the other aspect of this monument that is interesting and is the inscription of the names of the veterans, of the men who died, and the 187 Haverhill men who died in the conflict. So this was something, the inscription of names of the dead is something that I showed you that earlier, that slide of the obelisk monument in Wyoming, Pennsylvania, where there were names inscribed. And so there were a few monuments that had inscriptions of names of the dead on them before the Civil War. But the practice becomes much, much more common after the Civil War. It's by no means uniform, though. There are plenty of memorial Civil War soldier monuments that have no names on them at all. But there are also a lot, particularly I've noticed in New England, particularly at this time, these early monuments in the 1860s and 1870s, when the memory, I think, of these dead is very fresh in people's minds, they are often listed on the monument itself. And so this is a real interesting kind of, again, sort of innovation, because it's a lot of names. 187 names is a lot of names to put on a relatively small monument. And the idea of
Well, Kathleen, thank you for submitting it. Do you have anything else to add before we move on?
Just that we have no idea whether or not this is the totality of the number who died, because people were asked to submit the names of relatives and friends, and there was no record kept either of those who enlisted or those who actually died in the war, no record kept by the town.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was an interesting monument. Now, this next slide, ladies and gentlemen, when we ran this earlier today, we had problems actually seeing the image. I can see the image. It is of a slide at Monument Square in Troy, New York. If you can see that image, send me a green check. Is the image coming through for you folks out there? No, apparently it's not. No. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. All right. I wish you could see it. It is a magnificent memorial. It was sent by Bob Nair, and we appreciate that. But unfortunately, we're not going to get to discuss it because for some reason, the image will simply not come through. So let's move on to another one. This is an image, a memorial that I found in Hertford, North Carolina, which is a small town in the extreme northeastern part of the state. And as you'll see, it is an unusual memorial because it is in memory of the colored Union soldiers who fought in the War of 1861-65. And as Kirk said, a lot of these memorials, and particularly in the South, were erected by women's groups, and this was erected not by the United Daughters of the Confederacies, but the United Daughters of the veterans. Kirk, what do you make of this one?
Well, this is really an interesting one. First of all, this organization, the United Daughters of Veterans, is not one that I'm really familiar with, and I'd love to know more about it. So here's a great research project. And the monument itself is of course very modest. It looks like it's made out of granite. It was probably carved by a local cemetery stone cutter. So it was relatively inexpensive to produce. People might ask, well, why isn't there a figure of a soldier on it? Well, the first answer would be that that would be far more expensive. Second answer would be that would also probably would have been impossible in a town like Hertford, North Carolina, which was, I'm assuming, a segregated town at this time in 1910. We're talking about the height of that Jim Crow period. And even it's interesting, it would be really interesting for me to try to find out why and how this monument came to be erected even in the first place, how they got permission to do so from the town authorities, or if they did have to get permission from the town authorities, because it's actually very, very rare in the Confederate States to see any monuments from this period of time that recognize colored soldiers, black soldiers, African-American soldiers. The monuments, the Civil War monuments that are erected in towns like Hertford are Confederate, overwhelmingly are Confederate memorials. And so there's got to be an interesting story behind how this was able to be erected in the first place.
I think you're right. And as far as asking the town fathers for permission to build it, this is not in a prominent part of Hertford. This is in the black community in Hertford, and it's near a cemetery and across the street from a church. Now, there is another memorial in Hertford, which is in a prominent part of the town. It's this one, built in 1912, and that's the courthouse in Hertford behind it. So very different.
Right. So here, I gave a set of questions. Again, to refer you back to the set of questions that I put up with the slide of the Boston Union Memorial on Boston Common, which you can ask really about any public monument. But those questions are really relevant here. The question of location. This monument is, in a sense, the official monument, the official Civil War monument of the town, just by virtue of its location on the courthouse green, which is a very, very common one. And if we can go back just one again, you can see on the bottom slide the inscription "Our Soldiers," and that's again very typical, but sends a very strong message. Who is that? Who is our soldiers? Who is the we here? Well, obviously, they're not referring to those colored soldiers commemorated by the little monument on the outskirts of town in the black section of town, who were Union soldiers. Our soldiers refers to the white Confederate veterans and soldiers. So the question of who is the we that is behind the monument and why is obviously a very important one. I said monuments are intrinsically political. This is a political monument because it's asserting that the we that matters in this town is the white population and the ex-Confederate population of the town, the descendants of the Confederacy. Now, I don't know much about the politics of Hertford, North Carolina, but there are plenty of places in the South where there were significant white Unionist populations, and they also are not represented obviously by Confederate memorials. And one thing that the monuments do is to give a misleading impression of a kind of unity and consensus around the monument. the monument is erected, it appears on the courthouse green. In a sense, it's supposed to represent the entire community, as if the entire community supports it and belongs to that we that says our soldiers.
We've
But
got
that is not, in fact, the case.
Right, we've got a number of questions in the chat, and I'll get to them, but could you comment on the inscription? They fought for what they believed to be right and sealed their faith in blood. And compare that to the inscription we had in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where the war was clearly fought for union. How do we finesse the issue of the cause of the war, the reason for the war in the South?
Right. Well, this is a very typical Confederate inscription. I have seen dozens and dozens like this in other communities throughout the Southeast. Remember, this is erected in 1912, so they're not going to say, you know, the partisanship of the war is long past. I mean, we're 50 years. That's 50 years behind us at this point. So they're not going to make some statement like, you know, we were right to defend slavery. We were right to fight for, you know, the rights of slaveholders or anything like that. In fact, you know, they completely stay away from that kind of language. And so they come up with this much more abstract language about fighting for what they believed to be right, or what they believed was their cause. So the inscription doesn't actually say that the cause was right. What it says is that they fought for what they believed to be right. And this is very, very typical. And remember, in 1912, you know, the Spanish-American War has already occurred, where both white Northerners and white Southerners fought side by side, you know, for the United States. And World War I is only, you know, the entry of the U.S. in World War I is only 5 years away.
We have a question here. What can you say about Southern monuments? Is there a victor versus loser characterization? And was the South prohibited from erecting monuments by the U.S. government for some time after the war?
No. I mean, really, the answer to that question, the answer to both questions is really no. There really isn't a character. There isn't a loser character to the Confederate monuments. There are a few Confederate memorials that have standing soldiers on them with heads downcast, looking down towards the ground. And that is a kind of allusion. I mean, that is an allusion to defeat and death. But those tend to be actually quite rare. The monument that I showed you from Texas is much more commonplace. And in fact, they look identical to Union memorials, to the standing soldiers. Most Confederate and Union memorials are essentially interchangeable. The only differences are the details of the uniforms and the wording of the inscriptions.
We have some. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And so the second question about were they prohibited? No, they weren't prohibited, though it depended on the politics of the particular towns. In the mid to late 1860s, when there were Reconstruction governments in place, there would have been no authority to erect a Confederate memorial if there was a pro-Reconstruction, mayor of the town or a state government and so on. It would have been extremely difficult to erect a Confederate memorial anywhere except in a cemetery. And it is when those Reconstruction governments start to fall, and when white supremacist governments begin to take over at both the local and the state level, and I'm using that's the term that they themselves used, white supremacist. When those local governments began to take power, that's when Confederate memorials begin to go up.
Mm-hmm. And another questioner has asked if there are memorials to women and to non-combatants in the Civil War.
Very, very, very few. So the example of non-combatants, again, an interesting one. So that's precisely what the freedmen would have been if it had been erected, as Howell suggested, as a Union War memorial. He was a fugitive slave, but he was obviously a non-combatant. He wasn't an army. He wasn't shown in uniform. And monuments to women we begin to see monuments to nurses like Florence Nightingale, or to, those, again, are very, very rare, but they begin to pop up towards the end of the 19th century. But hardly any compared to the overwhelming numbers of soldier monuments.
I see. And then we had a question earlier about the dangers to monuments. You mentioned vandalism, I would imagine, just wear and tear, the weather, erosion, anything else that might affect the duration of monuments these days.
Yeah, there are a number of things. One is where they're located. If they are located out in a street, in an intersection, they tend to fare much more poorly. They get run into by trucks and knocked over. And then there is sometimes deliberate vandalism as well, like we saw in that fairly shocking image of the relief sculpture on the Boston Common Monument. And in some rare cases, there are examples of some Southern Confederate era monuments or lost cause monuments that were actually taken down. So there was, for example, it wasn't actually a sculptural monument, but it was a plaque on a large rock in Concord, North Carolina, that commemorated the formation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1868. And that is no longer there. That was taken down sometime during, I think, the early 70s. It was up for about three decades.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I went looking for it one day and couldn't find it.
Mm-hmm. Well, here we've come to the some material that Kirk has assembled for us. Some of you had asked about resources for further reading. Kirk, you want to comment on any of these titles?
Okay. Well, I put a couple of my own pieces down, not because I want to trumpet my own work, but because they're actually very easily available online. And I wrote these pieces as ones for general audiences that could be, so they're the kinds of things I think that everyone should be able to understand and get something from. The first one, The Past and the Present, The Life of Memorials, is more of a kind of thought piece on what is the function of memorials and how they've changed over time. The second one really is a literature review that I wrote in 2006, so it's already out of date now by a few years. But again, there were a couple of you who asked about and kind of wanted to get into some of the theoretical issues involved in collective memory and the erection of public monuments. And this essay really does get at that. It really tries to kind of lay out the scholarly theoretical terrain around this subject. But then I also just gave a few examples of really major books that have come out that are cited all the time on various different kinds of major historical events. David Blight's book on the Civil War, Race and Reunion on the Civil War in American Memory is now the classic text on the subject. He talks about public monuments, but he talks about a lot of other things, including Memorial Day, the origins of Memorial Day, anniversaries, all kinds of commemorative activity, not just the erection of permanent public monuments, how the war was remembered in literature, and so on and so forth. There's a similar kind of book by J. Winter on World War I. It's been very, very influential, and a terrific book on Holocaust memory here by James Young, Texture of Memory, which actually goes into and discusses quite a number of Holocaust memorials in both Europe and the United States. And so these all also give they're written by different kinds of scholars from different kinds of fields, and they give you different approaches to the subject.
We have a couple of questions coming in here. One is, are memorials different if the war is lost or won? they don't seem to be that different in the North and South in the case of the Civil War. But the Vietnam War memorial is certainly different. How does it make a difference? What difference does it make if the war is lost or won? I mean, as far as memorials are concerned.
Right. Well, that's where I came in. Years ago, I did my dissertation on the subject of Civil War memorials, and I came in with the idea that there must be some interesting differences between Northern and Southern Union and Confederate monuments. And I'd looked in Europe, for example, where after the France's war with Germany in 1870, which France lost very quickly and kind of ignobly, a whole iconography of defeat emerged in French war memorials in the 1870s. And so it's interesting, with images of dying soldiers, for example. It's interesting that that didn't happen in the United States. It didn't happen after the Civil War. And that the monuments of the two sides became so very similar is in itself one of the issues that I really try to deal with and explain in my book, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves. And I say that it largely has to do, I believe, with the formation of a new white racial identity after the Civil War and the exclusion of African Americans really from the body politic in the country. And so the issue of defeat became much less important to that much more overriding issue of establishing a kind of white nationality. In other cases, to take the Vietnam example, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington is, in a sense, does reflect the outcome of the war, in that it really focuses on the dead soldiers and, it's underground, it's below grade, and so on. It's very different from the kind of celebratory monuments that were erected after victories. And that's very much true. However, if you look at local Vietnam Veterans Memorials erected around the country, you're going to see that pattern is really quite different, and it's much more in the kind of soldier. There are a lot of realistic images of soldiers, and it's much more, again, kind of about the American military tradition than it is about the uniqueness of that war.
Well, I know that the Vietnam Memorial was very controversial when it was built, and if you go there now, you see a more standard more standard memorial commemorating the war right next to it on the same grounds.
Right. You have a soldier monument, there too. Mm-hmm.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to put Kirk's reading suggestions on the forum. So if you want to capture them, you needn't worry about jotting them down now. They will be available to you on the forum. And I notice in the chat, many of you are sending other suggestions for reading. If you'll please go to the forum and post those so that people will have easy access to them. We've pretty well come to the end of our time now. Let me ask, are there any questions or comments that you would like to make before we wrap things up? Okay, Lou he's got a lot of reading to do there. You've got a lot of good suggestions. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please, I mentioned the forum. Please use the forum to continue the discussion. Post your reading suggestions. Professor Savage will be available on the forum until November 19th. So if you have questions or comments for him that you think of after the seminar, please post them there and we'll get back in touch with you. Please remember to submit your evaluations. I want to thank all of you for your participation this evening, and I particularly want to thank Kirk for giving us a really interesting and illuminating seminar. I hope you'll join us again for another online professional development seminar. Right now, to escape our virtual classroom, you just go up to the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the word File. Click on that. A drop-down menu will appear. The last item is, I think, Exit Session or something like that. Click on that, and you're home free. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening.